He was in his mid-50s and somewhat overweight. He was an impressive, seasoned soldier who understood the art of warfare and practiced it effectively. An intellectual, a political and philosophical thinker, and an avid reader, he was deeply respected by both his men and subordinate officers. Obalaton Napa, commander of the 1st Battery of the 187th Artillery Regiment. Herr General, I reported to him in his log house. "Good evening, Napa," he said, smiling warmly and extending his hand. "Have a seat." He gestured toward a table and signaled his orderly to pour wine for us. "How are things going for you?" he asked. "Just fine, Herr General," I responded. "How is the morale of your men?" "Excellent. They're fine soldiers, and their attitude couldn't be better." "How are your horses holding up?" "They're doing well. As long as they get a day of rest now and then and are properly cared for, they'll be fine." "Are you getting all the food you need for your horses and men?" "Jawohl, Herr General. We're well supplied." He was evaluating how well his supply operations were functioning. We were his forces, and he needed to use us to achieve his objectives. I gave him an honest and objective account of my situation. Up to that point, I had suffered few losses, and he was pleased with that. He looked thoughtful for a moment. "How do you think the campaign has gone so far?" he asked. "Great," I said enthusiastically. "Everything seems to be going according to plan." He didn't respond right away, his thoughts seeming to drift. "I was in Russia during the last war," he said finally. "I've experienced the Russian winter. It's savage, unlike anything we've ever known. It will come, and it will come soon. We're just in a small part of Russia now. Ahead of us lies a vast, empty land. If we don't take Moscow before the weather turns bitterly cold, I fear what may happen." He was clearly not optimistic. I was surprised, because up to that point, things had gone smoothly. But I knew he was intelligent, experienced, and capable, and I began to temper my own optimism. Had someone overheard our conversation and reported it to the Nazi Party, it could have cost General von Studnitz his career. His remarks might have been interpreted as defeatist, and the Nazis dealt harshly with any sign of defeatism. At first, the young officer was only slightly unsettled by old von Studnitz's comments. Only about a month later did he truly grasp what the Russian winter meant for himself and his men. In late September, it began to rain, and mud quickly became a serious problem. The wind whipped the rain into our faces and soaked our uniforms as we marched. Snow arrived in early October, but it wasn't cold enough for the ground to freeze, and everything turned to mud. By October 8th, the earth had become a complete quagmire. Great clumps of mud clung to our boots, and every step produced a smacking, suctioning sound. It wreaked havoc on the horses. We were also unprepared for the snow, as we had not received winter clothing. We reached Vyazma around mid-October. This was near Borodino, the site of Napoleon's last major battle before he reached Moscow. Here, our tanks were halted by determined Russian resistance. We caught up with them and fought in the same hills where Napoleon had once battled. The difference was that after Borodino, Napoleon encountered no further resistance until he reached Moscow. Unfortunately, that was not the case for us. Shortly after we arrived in Vyazma, Kroger summoned his company commanders and me to meet in his tent. This was a rare occurrence, so we knew it was important. When the four of us had seated ourselves on folding camp stools, he shared what was on his mind. "Gentlemen, from now on, our division will be a frontline unit," he said. "The panzer divisions are being pulled out for other deployments." Later, we learned they were being used to attempt a pincer movement around Moscow, aiming to cut off the city from receiving further aid from the rest of Russia. General Hoth's panzers were heading north through Kalinin, and General Guderian's were moving south through Tula. He paused, and we exchanged uneasy glances. From here on, until we reach Moscow, it's just infantry and artillery. Until now, the panzers have had all the glory in this campaign. Let's show them what infantry and artillery can do without them. From Vyazma onward, the 87th Infantry Division was never out of combat. It was infantry and artillery alone, fighting as a broad front toward Moscow. My battery marched, as always, with the infantry battalion we supported. We would occupy one village, while the Russians held the next. During the night, the infantry would send out patrols to locate the weakest points in enemy resistance. In the morning, my battery would open fire on targets in the next village, which was typically 7 or 8 kilometers away. Then, our infantry battalion would advance. In most cases, we would capture that village and the next, staying overnight before repeating the process the following day. Depending on the terrain, how many creeks, hills, and other obstacles we faced, and the level of resistance, progress varied. The sound of combat was deafening. It was like combining every loud noise anyone had ever heard into one colossal, overwhelming roar. It was a virtual hurricane of sound, but unlike a storm, it didn't pass. It persisted as long as the fighting continued. The roar of battle was a fusion of heavy artillery, light artillery, mortars, machine guns, hand grenades, rifles, every weapon used on the battlefield. The noise alone was enough to shatter a soldier's will. Every weapon used on the battlefield. The roar of combat alone was enough to shatter a soldier's will. But battle was far more than just noise. It was a whirlwind of iron and lead that howled around the soldier, slicing through anything it struck. Even within the chaos of battle, strangely, a soldier could still distinguish the whistle of bullets and the hum of shrapnel fragments, perceiving each sound individually. A shell bursting here, the rattle of machine gun fire over there, an enemy soldier hiding behind cover in another spot. Despite the confusion swirling around him, the soldier retained a clear sense of his own strength and the strength of the men beside him. He felt an almost tangible bond of solidarity with his fellow fighters. This was the brotherhood of the combat soldier. As improbable as life in combat was, over time it became the only reality. The soldier soon found it difficult to remember anything else. He would try to recall the face of a loved one, and fail. The soldier to his left and the one to his right became his only reality, and in truth, the only loved ones he had. Life became an endless cycle of grueling physical labor, raw courage, fleeting moments of laughter, and a terrible sense of living out a merciless fate that would inevitably end in death or mutilation. It was a harsh destiny for young men. Strangely, the more stalwart and physically imposing men were often more likely to lose their nerve in combat than those who appeared weaker. By late October, the mud had become so thick that nothing could move through it. All movement ceased, except on railways and paved roads, which gave the Russians time to reinforce their positions behind the front lines. Even infantry on foot could move only with great difficulty. Nothing on wheels or tracks could advance at all, except on the post road or railways. The only way we could move vehicles was by corduroying the roads, laying small tree trunks side by side to create a solid surface. We built corduroy roads between our gun positions and our supply sources at division headquarters. These roads were rough and difficult for the horses to walk on, and the vehicles jolted violently over them, but at least we could transport ammunition and supplies. Headquarters. These roads were difficult terrain for the horses, and the vehicles jolted violently over them, but at least we could transport supplies and ammunition. The hard freeze came on November 7th, which proved to be both a blessing and a curse. We could move again, but now we were freezing, because we still hadn't received winter clothing. We wore the same field uniforms we had used during the summer, plus a light overcoat. It seemed inexplicable that winter gear hadn't reached us. The quartermaster staff were doing a good job supplying everything else, but winter uniforms never arrived. We tried to spend nights in villages to escape the elements. In November, this far north, we had only 7 hours of daylight. We would begin well before sunrise and continue long after sunset. As long as we kept marching, our physical movement helped stave off the cold. In the forest, we kept the horses behind houses at night and strapped blankets on them to shield them from the wind. Their winter coats of fur helped, although a few still died overnight from the cold. On November 12th, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, even during the day. We began looking forward to passing through villages, just for the chance to warm up inside the local peasant huts. When we reached the village that was our objective for the day, I left the infantry and returned to my battery to check how they were coping with the cold. I found Steinbach in a hut, trying to get warm. "How are the men doing?" I asked. "They're freezing, Herr Oberleutnant," he said. "I'm seriously concerned about frostbitten toes if this continues." I went outside and wandered among the men as they parked the guns for the night, positioning them so we could fight if necessary. They fed, watered, and rubbed down the horses. I tried to inspire a little more confidence in them, simply by being present. I found Yashka helping to strap blankets around the horses. "How are you holding up, Yashka?" I asked. "We have to get all the men inside, Herr Oberleutnant," he said, "at least for part of the night. They'll die in this cold if they have to stay out all night." I called Yashka and Steinbach together, and we arranged a schedule to rotate the men in and out of the available huts during the night. The Russians had a real advantage over us. They wore warm felt boots and quilted uniforms, while we had only thin overcoats that offered little protection from the cold. The only reason we were ever given for not receiving winter clothing was that we were moving too fast. Excuses for failure always sound plausible. Some of our soldiers took felt boots from dead Russian troops, but we didn't dare risk wearing their heavier quilted jackets for fear of being mistaken for Russians and shot. Fortunately, we could pull down the flaps of our field caps to keep our ears from freezing. The men wrapped their blankets around themselves, over their overcoats and caps, and cursed those responsible for failing to provide us with proper winter gear. The snow blew almost horizontally in blizzards that sometimes lasted all day, with the wind piercing our faces like 1,000 needles. The cold numbed and deadened the human body from the feet upward, until the entire body became an aching mass of misery. To stay warm, we had to wear every piece of clothing we owned, layering ourselves as best we could. Each man fought the cold alone, pitting his determination and willpower against the bitter winter. We reduced sentry duty from 1 hour to 30 minutes, and eventually to just 15 minutes. The cold was, quite simply, a killer. We were all in danger of freezing to death. We soon learned that warming up in a peasant hut could be dangerous. The combination of newspaper-covered walls and dried-out wooden boards created a perfect recipe for disaster. I was inside one such hut with several others, trying to get warm and discussing our next operation, when suddenly the room burst into flames. Although we all escaped through the doors and windows, we learned that if a fire was kept burning in those peasant stoves for weeks on end, the entire hut became extremely flammable. The stove stayed hot, the walls stayed hot, and if the wood reached its flash point, a single match, struck to light a cigarette, could ignite the whole place. We stopped in a village to rest, warm up, and plan our attack for the next morning. My third halter, Schmidt, had taken my horses to a nearby barn so they could warm up. It was nearly dusk when we came under Russian artillery fire. A familiar slow whine rose to a piercing howl, followed by a series of thunderous explosions that shook the earth. The hut I was in wasn't damaged, but when I went outside to inspect the area, I found that the barn had taken a direct hit. Both of my horses lay dead in the snow. Although losing Schwaben and Prince was a great emotional blow, it wasn't a practical loss. We were in constant combat, and during battle, we marched on foot with the infantry rather than riding, partly to protect the horses and partly to stay warm. Horses were now used only to pull guns, ammunition, and supplies. Russian resistance grew increasingly determined as we approached Moscow, and our casualties began to rise sharply. At first, our losses had been light, and we had taken a seemingly endless stream of prisoners. But now, our progress was slowing. Resistance was stiffening. Prisoners were fewer, and our casualties were mounting. Stalin, who understood the Russians' deep love for their homeland, had declared this war to be the Great Patriotic War, and convinced his people that they were not fighting for communism, but for Mother Russia. It worked. By December, we were no more than 25 kilometers from Moscow, but the temperature had become paralyzing. Heavy snow fell on December 1st, and the pitiless cold grew unbearable. Our world had transformed into a vast, frozen abyss where the white snow glittered in the flashes of gunfire and turned pink or green under the glow of signal flares. Mortars were of little use. Their explosions were muffled by the deep snow. Although we were freezing, our bodies still generated enough warmth to sustain the lice that fed on us. We had become, quite simply, frozen and exhausted men, constantly tormented by vermin. We felt more like livestock than human beings. The snow seemed to fill the air with a soft mist, blending earth and sky into one meaningless blur. It drifted across the flat terrain, swirling and forming strange, surreal patterns. Frostbite was beginning to take its toll, sending men home with amputated toes or fingers. I hadn't worn clean clothes in 2 weeks. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to stand under a hot shower and scrub my back with a stiff bristled brush. The thought was maddening, and I quickly forced it from my mind. On December 4th, we were in Raskazovka, a village just outside Moscow. We had established a defensive line around the village the night before. In the early hours of a freezing, miserable morning, just as my battery was preparing to lay down a barrage on the next village, we spotted a group of 30 to 40 Russian soldiers advancing across open ground. Our infantry opened fire with mortars and machine guns, driving them back. A short while later, they attacked again, this time in company strength, about 150 men. Again, our infantry repelled them. Then they attacked in battalion strength, roughly 500 men. We could see them moving out about 3 kilometers away. I got my guns ready and opened fire on them, but they kept coming. It was pure suicide. They were out in the open, with no tanks, no artillery, and no protection of any kind. They advanced to within 200 meters before being completely decimated. I couldn't believe they would behave so irrationally. I went out to see if I could learn anything that might shed light on the reason behind such suicidal behavior. Hundreds of dead and wounded lay in the snow, horribly mangled and splattered with blood, their eyes growing dim as their lives slipped away. Our medics moved among them, tending to those who were still alive. "They all appear Mongolian," said a voice behind me. It was Kroiga, who was also apparently searching for clues. "All the Russians I've seen until now have been Caucasian," I replied. "You're right," he said. "What do you suppose that means? And why, in God's name, would they waste infantry against artillery? That's worse than foolish. It's criminal to waste lives like that." "Maybe they thought we were so weakened by the cold that they could just walk in and take us," Kroger speculated. "Perhaps they had fresh troops. If they had waited until night, they might have had a better chance," I said. "But they didn't stand a chance in daylight, when we could use artillery against them." As we approached the outermost suburbs of Moscow, paralyzing blasts of cold hit us, and the temperature dropped far below zero, and stayed there. Our trucks and vehicles wouldn't start, and our horses began dying from the cold in large numbers. For the first time, they simply collapsed in the bitter darkness of night, and we would find them dead the next morning. The Russians knew how to survive in this weather. We did not. Their vehicles were built and conditioned for these conditions. Ours were not. We now numbly wrapped ourselves in blankets. Everyone felt brutalized and defeated by the cold. The sun would rise late in the morning, as harsh now in the winter winds as it had been in the heat of August. Not a single fresh footprint could be seen, as far as the eye could reach. Frostbite was taking a heavy toll. More and more men were being sent back to field hospitals with frozen fingers and toes. Many infantry companies had been reduced to platoon size. On December 5th, the temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. It was nearly impossible for the human body to function in such numbing cold. We reached our objective, Paradelkino, by noon. Our feet felt like awkward blocks of ice as we struggled to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving. I found myself wondering if anything could possibly be worth such suffering. The flesh on our faces and ears would freeze if left exposed for too long, so we wrapped whatever we could around our heads to prevent frostbite. I couldn't help but think of Napoleon's army retreating from Moscow. Our fingers froze even inside gloves and stuffed deep into our overcoat pockets. They were so stiff from the cold that they refused to perform even the simplest tasks. We couldn't have fired our rifles if we'd needed to. I couldn't help wondering whether our superiors in Berlin had any idea what they had sent us into. I knew such thoughts could be considered defeatist, but at that moment, the threat of punishment seemed irrelevant. Instead of moving on immediately after reaching Paradelkino, as we normally would have, some of us went into a peasant hut to get warm. The cold was surely going to kill us if we didn't. Oberleut Schumann, the battery commander of the 3rd Battery, and I, along with our forward observation officers and an infantry lieutenant, all entered the same hut to try to warm up. We shouldn't have gathered so many key officers from 2 artillery batteries in one place, where a single strike could have wiped us all out. But the cold was beyond human endurance, and we had to get warm if we were to survive. We were sitting on the stone stove in the center of the hut, just beginning to thaw out, when we heard the sharp cracks of tank cannons. We had received no warning from our infantry. We had just stood up to investigate when a tank shell crashed through a corner of the hut and exploded. Shrapnel tore through the room, scattering broken and bleeding bodies, filling the air with smoke, the acrid smell of burned powder, and the stunned cries of wounded soldiers. 2 men were killed instantly. Instantly. Although he was still alive, Schumann's face was covered in blood from a head wound that was clearly very serious. Blood was also flowing from his arm and neck. The blast had knocked me to the ground, and when I tried to stand, I collapsed again. I realized I had sustained a head injury as well, and had lost my sense of balance. Seeing blood on my sleeve, I examined my arm and discovered that a chunk of flesh, about the size of a large coin, was missing from the upper part of my left arm. Further inspection revealed a piece of shrapnel lodged in the metal insignia on my collar, which had, quite possibly, spared me a devastating neck wound. Everyone in the room was either dead or wounded. I called for a medic to tend to Schumann. He was able to speak, but he was gravely injured. A large man, 6'5" and well over 200 pounds. Perhaps he had simply been too big a target. The medics applied rough bandages to our wounds. 8 or 10 Russian tanks had managed to slip past our exhausted infantry unnoticed. We hadn't seen Russian armor for some time, and were likely not as alert as we should have been. They had found a depression in the terrain that allowed them to move undetected, catching us completely off guard. It was a poor performance on our part. Had we not all been so focused on escaping the cold, it might not have happened. Their tanks didn't have infantry support, however, so they came just close enough to the village to fire into the houses, then withdrew. Tanks without infantry are extremely vulnerable. The first time I was wounded, in France, I had been shocked. But when it happened again, I simply thought, okay, it's happened again, and I'm still alive. I'm lucky, and I hope I'll be just as lucky next time.